Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to Canusa Street. It's good to be back with you. You know, we take a different issue each episode, a different issue related to Canada-U.S. relations. And sometimes we say we're excited to have our conversation. The conversation today is a somber one, an important one, and one of the defining elements of Canada-U.S. relations over the last couple of decades. We're going to talk about Afghanistan. And as we record this episode, troops have pulled out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of aftermath happening. But I think we want to talk about how we got there in the first place, the Canada-U.S. element. We'll probably do a couple of episodes on it. So anyway, I'm really honored to be joined by our guest today. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Sands, for a proper introduction of our guests. And then we'll get right into the dialogue. So over to you, Chris.
Well, thanks very much, Scotty. And I'm really pleased that we're taking on this topic. A lot of people know about the war in Afghanistan, but for Americans, sometimes the Canadian contribution doesn't stand out. So just a couple of basic facts. The war in Afghanistan ran from 2001 to 2014 in terms of Canada's involvement, and it was Canada's longest war ever and its first significant combat engagement since the Korean War. After the 2001 September 11 attacks, Canada got involved in a broad mission to help secure and stabilize Afghanistan and respond to al-Qaeda. More than 40,000 members of the Canadian Armed Forces served in the 12-year campaign, which had multiple phases in Afghanistan. And the war resulted in 165 Canadians, of whom 158 were soldiers and 7 civilians died. Many Canadian veterans of the war are still carrying that with them, and I know it's been a very tough time for a lot of them to see what's been going on in Afghanistan. But we're very lucky to have our two amazing guests. I'll start with Colonel Charles Chuck Hamel, who was an infantry officer of the Canadian Forces with over 42 years of service and 1,000 days in combat operations, notably in Congo and also in Afghanistan, 2 tours. He had extremely distinguished service, and for those Americans out there, he earned the U.S. Bronze Star and Meritorious Service Medals from both the U.S. government and the government of Afghanistan. He's now a volunteer, is involved in a number of great causes. He's sort of a lifelong volunteer, a serial volunteer, if you will, but he's working with the Military Family Resource Center, the Friends of the Colonel Belcher Society, Opportunity International Canada, and Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, just to name a few. So he's still quite engaged on these issues. He's here with his good friend and high school pal, Neil Macdonald, who many Canadians know, longtime CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Washington correspondent. His career began with the CBC back in 1976, covered 6 elections, 6 prime ministers, and he actually joined the CBC in 1988, but his career began in 76. Sorry about that, Neil. And he's been reporting on federal politics for The National, but he also covered the Afghan war, both from the DC side and then talking about it in Canada. So couldn't ask for better guests, and we're really delighted to have them. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So thank both of our guests. And I think we'll start with you, Chuck. And just starting with the most recent and then maybe going back in time, what was your reaction and what was going through your mind when the U.S. and the Allies announced just recently that the war would end and that they would bring troops home? How did you feel about that?
I was a little disappointed and dismayed and not outraged like so many other Canadians were. My perspective was one that was a bit more subtle. And the reason being is because in my mind's eye, this could have been predicted. And if you look at it through the lens of Afghanistan's history, you come to realize that this is, in fact, just a blip in their very difficult history. I immediately, got involved in trying to get some of our interpreters relocated back in Canada. Again, it wasn't an outrage as the general public or as the media portrayed it, because our program, like the American program, I think it was the special immigration visas, the CIVs, we had something similar that went back 5 years. Some of the interpreters and so on took advantage of that and came over, but the vast majority basically wanted to stay in their homeland, and they were caught off guard like we were. So I am optimistic that in time, those that are at risk or that want to leave Afghanistan will get that opportunity, and they will be welcomed here in Canada.
And just thanks for that, Chuck. And just to follow up before I turn it over to Neil for his thoughts, when you say you were disappointed, were you disappointed with the policy decision to end the war, or were you disappointed with the execution of how it went down, or both?
My biggest disappointment, to tell you the honest truth, is related to the ongoing work I did when I came back from Afghanistan, and more specifically with an organization like the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, which I'll speak to a little later on. So they were there before we got there in 2001. They were there some 5 years before, dealing with this whole issue about girls and education and literacy. And, I'm very familiar with the investments that they made and the successes that they've had in that regard. And to see it all just vaporize, just disappear almost instantly.
Yeah, I mean, the really, what's going to happen to women and girls in Afghanistan is a huge concern. Neil, talk to us a little bit about your frame of mind. How do you think about Afghanistan? How do you put the whole situation in context of other conflicts that you've covered? What are your thoughts about it today?
Well, I don't have the same sort of moral authority on this that Chuck has. I mean, he walked the walk over there. I am not an expert in Afghanistan. I am, however, an expert in the Middle East. I spent 5 years there, and I covered conflicts in just about every country. And I suppose I've done the equivalent of a master's level degree in reading and researching the history of the area. I speak the language, and there are overlaps. When Chuck says it was somewhat predictable, it was entirely predictable. I remember when the Bush administration went into Afghanistan and was considering going into Iraq, my next door neighbor was an American diplomat in Jerusalem who was an expert. He was an Arabist. And he said, guys like me and my cohort of Arabists at the State Department, and I know Afghans are not Arabs, generally speaking, these days we keep our heads down and our mouths shut and hope we can hang on to our jobs because the White House already knows all the answers. It doesn't want to hear from experts. What happened in Afghanistan was the U.S. went in and set up a Potemkin army, much like Israel did in Lebanon. And I was there when the Israelis left Lebanon. The SLA, the Phalangist militia they stood up in the south of Lebanon, faded away within 3 hours. They were all across the border in Israel by nightfall, even though the Israelis had said they will be the bulwark against terrorism and they'll stand firm and they'll be brave and they're well trained. It's the same thing. I mean, when you've got people who are basically stood up by a foreign country and paid and trained against an indigenous, often religiously motivated army, there's no doubt about who's going to win. And beyond that, the idea of changeability in that part of the world, I mean, I would challenge anyone to tell me, and maybe Christopher, you can, tell me one example of the United States intervening in that part of the world successfully.
Well, I mean, Osama bin Laden is gone. So, I mean, I don't want to say the mission. Let's separate out the mission from
dead, right. But he was created by the United States of America just as much as Hamas was created by Israel, and for some of the same reasons.
Well, I mean, okay, we can have a debate about that, Neil. But
if they hadn't been supplying the insurgents in Afghanistan with modern weapons, as in a proxy war with the Soviets, Osama bin Laden probably wouldn't have existed. Now there are extraneous factors, but I'm just saying here that in my view, at least, these kinds of interventions don't work, especially in ancient societies that are tribal. Winston Churchill drew a lot of green lines on a map after the First World War, and I can tell you that didn't work out very well. It was permanent, it worked, but it didn't work out well. So trying to change these ancient societies is just a bad idea. And Chuck and I have disagreed on this in private conversations in the past. He believed in the mission in Afghanistan. I didn't.
Yeah. Well, so let's bring it back to Chuck for a second. And Chuck, a Canadian officer, served over there side by side with U.S. forces. Talk to us a little bit about that. What is the collaboration like? What was it like? What's your experience, with Canada and the U.S. working together? It's a talking point for people like Chris and me, about shoulder to shoulder in Afghanistan. But what is it really like? What was your experience like?
It was a very positive experience. Like you said, shoulder to shoulder. I was accepted. First of all, I was totally embedded in the U.S. organization, both from the military perspective and on the political side as well, with the embassies and so on. I personally thought that we worked very well as a team. And I know that my counterparts, my battle buddies, appreciated having a Canadian on board. One of the things that they took liberties of using me for was when they had a contentious suggestion to bring up at meetings with commanding generals and so on. They often passed the idea on to me, so I would voice it and articulate it, and they wouldn't have to deal with the wrath falling on them. So, I took that challenge on, and made my contribution accordingly. And I hope that we're going to have an opportunity to talk about some of the successes. And I'm kind of leaning towards the provincial reconstruction teams. And that merits considerable review. You must remember that whole concept actually started during the wars. I won't go back that far, the world wars that is. But in Vietnam, that was a very successful project at the very end of the Vietnam conflict. If I recall correctly, it was called Accords. And that was the precursor of today's PRTs.
Chuck, can you talk about the money that was given to you for development and the direction you got on how to spend it?
Yeah, so in the in my first tour back in 2005, 2006, I had this title, Director of Civil Military Affairs Division of the Combined Forces Command Afghanistan. Really what that was the CJ9 position. And we had ministry engagement teams that were in all the different ministries. And I was also responsible for the PRT policy team and the working groups. One of my duties was also to manage the CERP, the Commander's Emergency Relief Program. And basically the instructions that I got was, here's $500 million year in, year out, and go forth and do good.
That's a lot of soccer fields to build. $500 million a year.
I got to tell you quite honestly, there was a lot to be done because in terms of strategic infrastructure, as opposed to a lot of other countries, was virtually non-existent. There could have been significant more money, and there was. And that money was all with USAID. So it was a question of coordinating efforts with what USAID was doing and what the military was doing. And that coordination was done through the U.S. Embassy, and it was wanting because there was just so much to do and really not enough money. But some of the lessons that were learned out of there were quite significant. One of them was the money was probably used more towards force protection of our own forces instead of development.
Oh, that's interesting.
So The problem with that was the non-permissive areas or provinces and so on actually received more money than the permissive areas. So what do you think happened?
Yeah.
All the other provinces became non-permissive. Kinetic events going on. IEDs, yes. Bombings, killings, and so on. That would be a non-permissive environment.
And you would spend money to protect our forces when there are kinetic events happening versus when it's... So in other words, there was almost an incentive towards violence in a weird way if you wanted to get the money.
Well, it was almost a policy of reinforcing failure. And I hope that that's one of the lessons that is taken away from this conflict and so many others.
That I'm going to jump in on that because I don't know if you would have seen it, but at Andrew Potter at McGill, he's part of the Max Bell School, had a piece in Policy Options. And he summed up Afghanistan by saying, you know, the case for the success of Canada's involvement in Afghanistan was that it strengthened in useful ways the relationship between Canada and the United States. And I know you saw this from different sides. Chuck, you were on the ground. Neil, you were covering this at the government to government level. Do you think that's borne out in your experience that the U.S. and Canada suffering together or trying to do this together, there was some reinforcement of the bilateral relationship? Or do you think because of disagreements about how it went, maybe it pushed us farther apart?
Potter was right. When I moved to Washington from the Middle East in 2003. Colin, I think it was Colin Robertson at the embassy who dreamed up this campaign where they put up gigantic banners in the Foggy Bottom metro station and the metro center saying boots on the ground. Remember the boots on the ground? And it seemed to me, and again, I'm not an insider, but I covered these things. It seemed to me that I'm always fascinated by the reasons for going to war or going to a conflict. I mean, the Israelis do it for a very pragmatic reason. When Canada does it, it's often to impress somebody, or it has been since the Second World War, and even then, I suppose. But Chuck, I mean, I used to call him Charlie when we were kids. We have completely different perspectives. He fought on the ground. I covered these things at the governmental level and as a war correspondent, and I used to watch. I've seen lots of soldiers get killed, maybe not as many as Chuck, but plenty. And then I hear their politicians and their parents say they died for freedom. And how does that add up if you got blown apart in some dusty nowhere backwater in Iraq or Afghanistan, and with a it's almost like the chronicle of a death foretold. You know what's going to happen if you're a student of history at all. And I always felt so bad for soldiers who were in good faith trying to make a difference, but were in fact, in my view anyway, serving a political purpose that was a little more jaded. And I say that with all respect to what Chuck did for a living for that many years. He went into danger we both went into danger, but of different kinds. And I guess you have to believe it if you're a soldier, and you don't have to believe it if you're a journalist. I don't. I would quite seriously question what good it did the Canadian people beyond economic links with the Americans going to Afghanistan and good on Jean Chrétien for not going to Iraq. That would have turned out really well, wouldn't it?
Chuck, what was the feeling on the ground? Soldier to soldier.
Well, I got to tell you quite honestly, I mean, the Canadians took over the PRT in Kandahar. When I was there on my first tour. Yeah. And we felt really good about relieving the Americans of that specific PRT, which was probably one of the most important ones, and being involved in into the most non-permissive part of Afghanistan at the time. And it kind of said, hey, the Americans trust us. They trust our soldiers are good enough to hold the fort and to have an effect, a positive effect on the outcome. So and the other thing that it did, of course, was it permitted the Canadian military to bring back all the capabilities that we got rid of before the Afghanistan war. In other words, we had very little indirect fire capability. In other words, we got rid of all our artillery pieces. When we were in Afghanistan, we got the M109, the 777s, which is basically the same interoperable weapon system as the U.S. was using. We got rid of all our tanks. We got rid of our Huey helicopters. We got rid of our Chinook helicopters. And all of these capabilities we had to bring back in to the theater of operations. So, of course, that made the soldiers happy. The problem is that all those capabilities right now are rusting out, and I'm not sure if they're going to be sustained. All in all, bottom line, it was a positive relationship between the Americans and Canadians. And for that matter, all the coalition partners. You know, I look at, even your title, Hindsight Up Front, Lessons and Implications of Withdrawing from Afghanistan.
That's one of our Wilson programs. We're looking back at Afghanistan, but there you are, yes.
But, it's sort of the Americans left Afghanistan. No. It was the coalition. And, you had 60 countries that stepped up. So when we're saying that the Americans lost the war, wait a minute here. It was half the countries in the world just about that were involved, and we all lost as well, blood and treasure. Now, was it a complete loss? I'd like to think that it allows us to move forward into thinking about, hopefully thinking about this conflict in a different light. And hopefully we get to that a little later on in this interview.
Well, Chuck, maybe let's go there. And let me ask this question, and then you can take us in whatever direction you want. But you said something, thinking about the future. You said something that reminded me. I was talking to a Canadian official who was with CETA, the Canadian International Development Authority or agency, whatever that stands for, the Canadian version of USAID, who said, Canada was in there building schools and educating girls for many years. And the schools that were named for local people and local things survived shelling. And the schools that some of the coalition forces named after U.S., or coalition, Western kind of names were targets, actually. But that one of the most regrettable things is what does happen to women and girls going forward who are still there. And some of them who spent their whole life thinking, not as part of Taliban rule. What do you think the future is based on everything that's transpired over the last 20 years? I won't go back to Neil Macdonald channeling Rand Paul, channeling no intervention for 100 years. But so what do you think? What do you think is going to happen for women and girls in Afghanistan? How do you see it? And realistically, you said you're a little bit hopeful, but what do you think? What do you think about that? And go ahead and talk about lessons learned, the things you want us to talk about here today on this podcast.
Okay. The prognosis, holy mackerel. I don't think it's that great, actually. But I'm kind of thinking that the lessons learned might be more applicable in other theaters. Doubt very much there's going to be an appetite for either the Americans or ourselves or any other coalition partners to go back into Afghanistan, irrespective of what happens there. I mean, I got my own hypothesis of what's going to happen. And, can you say China? I'm more worried about them than any other country. And they're already there. And they're looking at that rare earth. And they're looking at those mineral deposits. And by God, they are going to get them out of there, even if there is no infrastructure. That's problematic for everybody. And that's
the subject of a whole other podcast. We're going to talk about critical minerals and rare earths. We're going to talk about China and all of that. But you're right to raise it, Chuck. That's a strategic point of importance.
But some of the lessons learned. I mean, first of all, and foremost, I'm a big advocate of strategic communications and information operations. I mean, we started off this whole thing by a Hearts and Minds campaign and all the rest of this stuff. And it's kind of like, well, Hearts and Minds, there's something fundamentally wrong with trying to win the hearts and minds of Afghans. I mean, we don't even speak their language, please. But really, what we're trying to do is we're trying to win the trust and confidence of the Afghans for the government of Afghanistan. So it's really a two-pronged strategic comms initiative that has to go on. On one hand, the hearts and minds for domestic consumption, and on the other hand, trust and confidence for the theater of operations. And that we still don't have a good, solid handle on in differentiating the two and why the two have to go on concurrently and they have to be aggressive. We have to win the battle of the narratives before we can win the war of perception. So that's first and foremost. How do you win that trust and confidence? How do you get the legitimacy? I would suggest that it starts with PRTs. And the PRTs not in the way that we traditionally think of it in terms of a military footprint. The PRT that actually my thesis at the Center of Military Strategic Studies was on PRT transformation, supporting stability operations in Afghanistan.
You need to explain the acronym, Chuck.
The Provincial Reconstruction Teams. And, that had a history in itself in Afghanistan. I mean, it started off with the Special Forces deploying their civil affairs teams. So they were small little groups that were, trying to do their stuff of winning hearts and minds of Afghans. Again, wrong term. And then they realized that, holy mackerel, there's a lot of work to be done. So it grew into something that we call chiclets. I can't remember for the love of me what the acronyms stood for, but it was based on the Vietnam Cords concept. So it was much more robust, and it was physically located on the ground and not mobile like the civil affairs teams were. And then eventually that grew into joint regional teams, JRTs, which later were rebranded and renamed by Karzai. So President Karzai, he's the one who called them provincial reconstruction teams. And that helped immensely, having the president bless this type of capability and assisting it moving forward. So, yeah, PRTs. Now, in my particular thesis, the ultimate aim was not to have a military PRT, but eventually it would transition into being a civilian capability. And what I have proposed is that the PRTs be very light, a very light footprint on the ground with a huge reach back capability. In Afghanistan, the only reach back capability that they were looking at was a tactical one, was how do we get a rapid reaction force to the PRT in the event that shit hits the fan. That's what it was basically limited to. Eventually, us smart Canadians came up with a 3D concept for, of course, defense, diplomatic, and development. Okay. And then that grew, and I think it was the Brits that first brought it on to make it a whole of government concept. So these PRTs just grew enormous. And with the more people that you had into the PRT, the more force protection that you have. So they become very large footprint on the ground. And that's no longer necessary. I'm suggesting that the PRC, in accordance with the original concept, has to be co-located in this particular case, in the provincial administration, the Afghan provincial administration centers. And for some reason that was abandoned, but that was the concept, and that needs to go back to that. And then we have to start looking at what are the reach back capabilities, and that's endless. The sky is the limit. You could have all the whole of government representatives that are back in the homeland that you're reaching back to provide you with the answers that you're looking for, depending on what the need is in that provincial, in that province. and they varied from province to province. Now, I'll leave that aside just for a nanosecond and talk about more in terms of what actually needs to be done on the ground. And from the lessons that I learned, some of the fundamental stuff has to happen at a grassroots level. So first and foremost, literacy. Now, why do I put literacy as the first priority? And by the way, during our time there, literacy went from 8% of the population to close to 50% of the population. A lot of that was attributed to the fact that we got, about 3 million girls that were back in schools. But we learned the lesson the hard way, because as we were building the Afghan National Security Forces, and we were getting close to our target, the Afghan National Security Forces, of course, comprising of the ANA, the Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, border guards, and any other security apparatus that is necessary for any nation. So we built this, humongous ANSF of 350,000 plus, armed, mostly men, and we couldn't move to the next step. I mean, we produced a lot of Kandaks, which are basically battalions of soldiers, and they were good soldiers. But when it came time to move to the next stage in dealing with capabilities like logistics, for example, couldn't do it because they were illiterate. And we came to the realization, when I say we, collectively, came to the realization that we have to be involved in improving the literacy of the Afghan National Security Forces. So we actually built that in to the construct. So a soldier would join the ANSF, police or army, and they would go to grade 1 literacy. And then they would go through their basic training. Those that demonstrated any leadership potential went to grade 3 literacy. And then, and so it was totally embedded, the whole literacy program, right into the ANSF. One of the second order effects that happened, or unintended consequence, which was very positive, is we no longer needed to recruit. Because the disenfranchised men and all the rest of the stuff that couldn't get an education decided that we're going to join the ANSF, become literate, and move on from there. So it was a very positive outcome in that sense. But we never got to a stage where the ANSF writ large was literate enough to be able to sustain itself into more complex stuff. So that's literacy.
You know what, Chuck, on that, what you're reminding me is I think we need to have a whole deep dive on growth and recovery. So you've touched on something, and I don't mean to cut you short, but I think it's important enough that we should have a whole nother episode on it. And I know we're getting close to our ending time here. So maybe what I'll invite you to do is just give us kind of a few wrap-up comments. We'll invite Neil to do the same, and then we'll bring this particular episode to a close. But we want to invite you back because you're raising some really important concepts and realities of aid internationally and growth, which are rightly connected with what we're talking about, which is Afghanistan, but they're bigger than Afghanistan. So I want to give them their due. So let me just invite you to make a quick wrap comment. We'll invite Neil to do the same, and then we'll move forward.
The Afghans used sovereignty as the excuse why international aid had to come through the top and go down to the ground. That, of course, created a whole bunch of problems. And of course, corruption was one of the main outcomes for the government in Afghanistan. And that was a result of just too much money coming in and not enough capacity to be able to get it down to the projects on the ground. So invariably, they knew that if they emptied the bank accounts, it would be refilled again. And it just made things progressively worse. This way here, the money is going directly at the grassroots level to an individual. And that's how you build up your economy. I mean, there's one other thing that I'll kick in there that I learned from Afghanistan, had to do with land reform. And I'll just leave it there, okay? Because the guru on land reform, of course, is De Soto in South America. And that is the fundamental of creating a financial and economic capability in a country. So those are my 4 takeaways here: literacy, small power, microfinance, and we'll talk about land reform maybe at some other time. But the PRTs need to be on the ground. They are the eyes and the ears that are essential to make sure that things are progressing positively.
You know what Neil Macdonald's favorite thing is, besides having the first word, is having the last word. So Neil, we'll give you a chance to, you're so shy and retiring. I know I've got to invite you into this, but why don't you give us some reflections here and then we'll wrap up.
Well, you know, when you talk about lessons learned, Chris Sands works for the Woodrow Wilson Institute. I think the United States of America has to consider in future just how Wilsonian it wants to be. You know, Canada is bound eternally to the United States, will be in our lifetimes at least. We will be invited along for new military adventures. We'll have to have that debate and decide whether to go along with it. It does mean expending blood and treasure, but the question is whether it's worth it, and whether, you know, in Afghanistan, it was certainly worth going in and uprooting a group of men who threatened the global order. Whether it was wise to stick around and try to nation build is something else altogether. Iran was a different question completely. Going into Iran was utterly misguided. And the United States will, as successive presidents take power, decide that it wants to embark on new militarism. And we're going to have to decide whether to go along with it. And I think it should be done coldly and soberly. You and I have had these discussions recently, Scotty. We need to decide what is in each other's best interest and approach it not as you know, hugging neighbors, but as level-headed partners. And where war is concerned, you're always talking about, you know, young, largely uneducated, innocent-minded young men and women getting killed in far-flung places for things that they think are noble, but may not be noble indeed. And that's a tragedy when it happens. So I just think that the lesson of all of this is, for heaven's sake, when the next event happens, and it will, is it worth going, and what's the end game? It's such an important discussion to have. But that I guess would be a distillation of my experience in watching these things and how they play out in various countries. Well, it very seldom turns out well. It almost never turns out well.
Well, you know, we'll leave it there. And I just have to say, I don't know if back a million years ago when you two guys were in high school together, if you ever thought, you know, you'd be on a podcast together talking about, you know, one of the longest wars on earth, and its aftermath and what it all means. But it's really been fascinating to have both of your perspectives. We're incredibly grateful to you. And the last word goes to my friend Chris Sands.
Well, the last word is really just an echo of the thanks. One of the things I think that makes the Canada-U.S. relationship strong is the friendship among the people at the ground level. And I think politicians come and go, but they steward that. And they have to take good care of those connections. But when you put people on the ground, Canadians and Americans, that spark is there. And hearing you both of you talk about Afghanistan, pro and con, I think that is an echo of what you hear in the United States. And we're maybe closer than we think. Looking back at this experience, I think probably did bring us together, as Andrew Potter suggested. So great to hear from both of you, and thank you for being honest with us and sharing with us your perspectives looking back 20 years.
It's our pleasure.
Well, Chris, I don't know what I had as a preconceived notion about when we decided to have these two high school friends from Canada on to talk about their perspectives. One, a seasoned and acclaimed journalist, and one, a highly awarded soldier. But that was quite interesting, I think, to hear Chuck and Neil talking about Afghanistan and their different perspectives. And one of the things I really like about it is, Neil's pretty tough and he asks hard questions, maybe even harder than you and me. And it doesn't affect their lifelong friendship. And that's emblematic. They're two Canadians, but that's how Canada and the United States should be and are when we're at our best. We can ask each other hard questions and the friendship continues. So I thought it was a timely and interesting conversation. And I want to keep talking about Afghanistan and the other Canada-U.S. collaborations around the world. What did you think?
Well, very much the same. I said in just talking a little bit about the scene setter that, Canada's role in the war, I think people know it was there, but for many Americans, there's no detail behind that, not a real sense of what Canada was contributing. Hearing from Chuck about not only what they did, but how important it was to him, not because the Americans wanted it, but because it was the right thing to do. And that kind of connection with people on the ground is a really important one. It's one of the reasons our soldiers get along so well. Then in contrast, Neil Macdonald sounds like so many of my friends who, after 9/11, initially we have to get Al-Qaeda and then had doubts about the war. And even there was this passion, this concern, this engagement on the topic. And there's a reason that we think the Canadians are the most like us around the world. They really do reflect the kind of debates we have ourselves. But for the good of the relationship, we need to listen to the Canadian debates and hear those echoes of our own thoughts, because I think that brings Canada and the U.S. ultimately closer together.
I think that's right, but they need to listen to us too, Chris. So that will be the last word. We're glad that Canusa Street continues these difficult conversations, and I'm always glad to collaborate with you, my friend.
Same here, and at least you let me get a word in edgewise, so I love that about you.
Every once in a while it happens. All right, we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks very much, Scotty.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.